Okay, welcome to you all. Welcome to Colonel Torgerson and Mayor Colin Ribchester. I have to do the airline part now. Exits here, exits there. Toilets are available here. And at the end of the ceremony here now, I would ask you to allow our American visitors to depart rapidly because they have to be on site fairly quickly. So if you like, allow them to go first, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay. My first introduction is Richard Flagg, Chairman of the 490th Memorial Group. Are you with us? Yeah.
Thank you, Fred. Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the 490th Bomb Group Memorial Project, I'd like to welcome you all on this very special and historic occasion. Thank you to all of our friends for making the journey to be with us today, and in particular, all of you who've travelled from the US. We're especially honoured to have Cy Spiegel here, who is a pilot with the 490th, as well as other families who are based here. The Memorial Project was started just over 2 years ago to honour those men of the 490th Bomb Group who served here at Station 134, Eye Airfield. Some of these men never returned, and those that did forged lifelong friendships within the local community. We are here to remember and honour them all. They were the greatest generation. This has been a real community project that has seen considerable support from near and far, and I'd like to thank you all for being a part of this. You have made this day possible. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome to the stand our current Mayor, Colin Ribchester, Mayor of Eye. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great honour as the Mayor of Eye to welcome everyone here today to this very special occasion to commemorate fallen of the 490th Bomb Group. A special welcome to those supporters that have travelled across the pond to be with us this weekend. Thank you. It was in June 2014 a small group came together to raise some funds to create a permanent memorial dedicated to the young men who gave their lives to liberate Europe and end the oppression and aggression of Nazi Germany. This small band have achieved a great deal with the help of local residents and a great deal of support from America. The town is very grateful for all their hard work. The Roll of Honour and the permanent memorial will now be a constant reminder of the heroic deeds of the young American men who travelled to Little Eye in Suffolk and made the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you.
I'd like you to welcome to the next bit to our dear friend Eric Swain, the 490th historian.
I'm going to try and do this without blubbing. Just bear with me a minute. I've been asked to give you a potted history of the 490, and it will be potted because if I started on everything, I'd be here like I've been doing now for the last 25 years. I've met and known many of these guys and love them dearly. The 490th group was activated in 1st of October 1943 in Salt Lake City. Their home base in America was Mountain Home, Idaho, where they trained for their possible assignment. They didn't know, obviously, where they were going. They then were given their orders to move, and they were then moving to the European Theatre of Operations. They transitioned down through South America, up through Marrakesh. In those days was the route into England, through Land's End and into Eye. They were part of the 93rd Combat Wing, and they were a B-24 group at the time. They flew their first combat mission on the 31st of May. This was a recall One of the aircraft never heard the recall and carried on and bombed its target. They then, in August, due to the disparity in the flying characteristics of a B-24 and a B-17, it's only marginal, but if they were flying together, they had enough difficulty flying in formation as it was without having another aeroplane which was a little bit different in its characteristics of loadings, etc. So they then had to convert to B-17, so they became a B-17 group. They flew a total of 158 combat missions from the airfield. They then flew what are called chow hand missions, which were food drops to the Dutch after the war had finished. They flew 5 of these, and then a couple of missions to pick up what they called revival missions, picking up POWs and other people and bringing them back to their base. To give you an idea of what 158 missions doesn't sound a lot, but it was. But you've also got to understand that at the time, aircraft were moving, being repaired, etc. I've only got a small amount of the information of aircraft movements on the airfield, and that's over 10,500 at the moment, and I know that could be doubled if I could find the information. They then redeployed from Eye Airfield, and it was very quick. The locals will tell you they were there one day, and the aircraft were gone within 2 days. Each aircraft flew out. They flew out on the 6th of July and the 8th of July. Each aircraft had a 10-man crew and 10 passengers. Then the ground echelon and all the other personnel then shipped out in August, south from Southampton on the Queen Elizabeth, arriving in New York on 1st of September. The group was then at Drew Airfield and was inactivated on the 7th of November. That's as short as I can make it, and if you forgive me, I am very, very emotional with this. There are so many people here that I could name. There were 2 local people who run with what I call, it's really a relay race. People, I've only picked the baton up after so many people before me. Donna and Peggy Garnham, 2 local residents, lived at Yaxley, and they were kind enough to welcome me in. And with the veteran I first met, they passed all the information on to me, and that's what I try to do. The memory of these people should never, ever be forgotten. God bless you.
Okay, I'd like to now welcome Clive Stevens from the 490th Memorial Group, who is going to give us a very small presentation. About 2 or 3 hours.
Thanks, mate. What Eric has touched on, I think you're going to see a fair bit of today, and that's tears. And I think you're going to see it from all of us, because it's been an emotional project, something very close to our hearts. And if it doesn't get to you, you're not normal. The 490th Bomb Group Memorial Project presents a short history of the aerodrome. The World War II airfield construction programme in this country was the largest civil engineering project ever to take place in the UK, with nearly 500 military airfields built for the purpose. And at peak period of construction, a new airfield was being commenced every 3 days across the United Kingdom. By the winter of 1942, there were some 75,000 British and Irish civilian workers engaged on military construction projects alone, not including the Americans who'd come over to aid in construction as well. A lot of well-known British construction companies that we all know today, from house building and civil engineering and so forth, the likes of Taylor Woodrow, Wimpey Homes, Hay Mills in Stowmarket, the Bulmer Brick Company down near Sudbury that are still going today. A lot of these companies owe their success, or should I say their continuation, due to the airfield construction program, because it allowed them to be able to work throughout the war years doing what they did for a living. But it was black Afro-American soldiers from the United States that constructed the airfield here at Eye. They arrived direct from the southern states of Louisiana and upstate New York. They were assigned to units of the 923rd Engineer Aviation Regiment of the 827th, 829th and 847th Battalions. And they were based at Oakley Park, which is between Hoxton and Broome Village. It wasn't a camp, it was a field. But they put up bell tents and erected paths and things of this nature, and that's where they lived when they constructed the airfield. And they lived under canvas in very primitive conditions. The headquarters of 9th Engineer Command was at Hawley Park, adjacent to the A14 near Stowmarket. To give you an idea of the vastness of a typical Class A bomber airfield, here we have a photograph showing the construction of Eye Airfield in September 1942. You can see the A140 Ipswich Norwich Road on the left, and you can see that they've started to rough out the main line of where the main runway would be. And provision was made to accommodate 2,894 young Americans in a sleepy little backwater of Iron Broom. Can you imagine the impact that those men must have made on the local community? But 9th Engineer Command, who did all the construction work, were a pretty impressive outfit in their own right. They had 18 individual battalions, which consisted of 21,600 men within the organisation. Their primary role was construction and maintenance and ongoing base defence of the airfields, both in England and into Europe after the D-Day campaign, when the advanced landing grounds were being constructed. All personnel were required to work a minimum of a 10-hour day. 1 day in 10 would be entirely devoted to military training. They would work a 7-day week, and they were routinely reminded that they were first and foremost soldiers and secondly engineers. So they had to understand the principle of a rifle every bit as a trowel and a cement mixer. At the end of the war, the 923rd produced a very flimsy pamphlet detailing some of their efforts and their contribution to the war effort. And a lot of those photographs revolves around airfield construction in the Suffolk and Norfolk area, the Waveney Valley. Here we can see some pictures. This one here, for example, March into Church in Eye, Suffolk for Thanksgiving, 1943. And this is coming down the main road into Eye from the airfield. And shots over here, which are Hawley Park near Hoxton. Tibbenham Aerodrome on halfway to Norwich also. Some of the other photographs there. This is an official photograph with an official caption on the back. 20-year-old Master Sergeant Knowles Freeman from Pensacola, Florida, atop of a giant bulldozer. He is a member of the 829th Engineering Construction Company, building an airport near Eye, England, March the 2nd, 1943. These 21,600 troops that we're referring to in this section of the presentation had an extremely hard and tough war, and actually received very little recognition for the Herculean efforts that they undertook throughout the European campaign. In September 1993, one of their officers, Assistant Engineering Officer First Lieutenant Raymond Dozier, came back to Eye, and there he is stood on the main runway, reminiscing about his time when he was stationed here constructing the airfield with his troops. Another official photograph with an official caption. A surface grader invented by Master Sergeant Martin is shown in operation during the construction of Eye Airfield, England, June the 6th, 1943, a year to the day before D-Day. Some statistics to ponder about Eye Airfield. 32,000 square yards of tarmac were used, 175,000 cubic yards of concrete, 400,000 cubic yards of excavated soils, 8 miles of hedgerows uplifted and 1,500 trees removed. Provision for 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel storage. As the missions got longer, the targets got further, the fuel requirement got greater. You could write a book alone on transportation of fuel for the 8th Air Force. It would be a tome. 6 miles of water main, 4.5 million bricks. And this is simply one airfield, and 500 of them were constructed with the limited mechanization means of the day. And it cost back then £500,000 to build the airfield and £500,000 to build all the facilities and services necessary to keep the airfield operational. In essence, it took 3,000 men to keep 30 bombers in the sky. That is the principle. And when you do a good direct comparison with the American Air Force operating from our region today, the scale is quite similar in that in relation to aircraft operations, there is a huge undertaking going on behind the scenes. So as you can see, by the spring of 1945, in relation to the photograph taken in November 42, Eye Airfield had grown to totally outweigh the size of Eye Town itself. 3 active runways, so operations could be mounted regardless of the weather and the wind condition, dispersals for over 65 heavy bombers, and all the facilities that we've previously discussed. A lovely social history picture. Black troops parade alongside white GIs in Stowmarket, 1943. For those of you who know Stowmarket, you'll recognise this scene instantly, as it has hardly changed. You have to remember the colour segregation bar was forcibly enforced in the Second World War between the blacks and the whites. They didn't get on, as we know from the history books. What must this have sounded like in a sleepy little town like Eye? The famous 200 US Army Negro chorus voices. They sang at London's Royal Albert Hall, toured England and broadcast all over the world under the direction of Sergeant Alexander Jordan of St. Paul, Minnesota. And General Eisenhower, when he was writing his war memoirs in 1947, quoted, "I should say that the aviation engineers, along with the combat engineers, were among the most important people we had in the entire European war." It was an enormous construction effort. If we look at this diagram, you can see that the space that the airfield occupies in terms of square footage or acreage, or however you want to place it, was almost comparable to the amount of space that the living accommodation occupied. And this living accommodation went right into the village of Broome. So all the huts and the accommodation and so forth. You can see here a little cross, which is the church, the village church, and the church is right in the middle of the camp. For people living in Broome, how on earth could they have comprehended when they heard of the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941? How could they have ever imagined that an action on the other side of the world would ultimately have an enormous implication on their own day-to-day lives on this side of the world? As Eric told us, the 490th Bomb Group arrived direct from the United States from Mountain Home, Idaho, equipped with B-24 Liberator 4-engine heavy bombers, and they arrived and started operations in April 1944, and there they are, all lined up, look, on the active taxiway at the northern end of the airfield. And this is what we gave the guys to live in. It really wasn't much, was it? Our home in the ETO, the European Theatre of Operations. They were uninsulated, literally corrugated iron tin sheds with brick end walls and a pot-bellied stove and 20 cots. And that was where they lived. And the winter of 1944 was the coldest winter in this country in over 30 years. It really wasn't a lot of fun. Our base was named after a small town of Eye. And this photograph, you can see the propeller strike in the middle of the picture. That is taken from the cockpit, left-hand cockpit window of a B-17, and you can see the aerodrome in the distance below. This came from a snapshot from one of the veterans' photo albums. And here we have another nice photograph showing one of those huts we've just mentioned. We've got a waist gunner, Robert Ross, a tail gunner, James Starner, and a local lad by the name of Charles Flatman, who was a laundry boy and was in the Army Cadets. And Charles is sat here today and has been a stalwart supporter of the 490th Memorial Project, and it's a privilege to have you here. Nice colour photograph from the Mark Brown Air Academy files. He was a captain in the United States Army Air Force based at 3rd Air Division headquarters at Elvedon Hall near Thetford. And in the summer of 1944 and 1945, his job was taking photographs. And thankfully, we have an awful lot of colour images of the East Anglian region due to his collection of negatives. And another nice picture from Captain Arnold Delmonico, who was the base photographer in charge of the photography outfit on the base of a B-17 coming in to land on the east-west runway, descending over Langton Green. The memorial location where we're placing the memorial is just on the left-hand side of the photograph, approximately where that green shed is. So you can see that the memorial is going right where the action was. The bomb dump. Eye Airfield bomb dump was quite unusual in that everything was above ground. Most of the 8th Air Force bomb dumps were in forest or woodland. In the West Country, a lot of the bomb dumps were underground and in mine shafts and things of this nature. Because Eye was one of the very last airfields to be built, the bomb dump was all out in the open air with just limited blast shelters around it. And this is a colour photograph taken above the A140, looking north up the A140 towards Norwich to the expanse of the base. To any of you who know the area locally, the Swan Public House, the Oaksmere, Cornwallis as it was, the industrial estate on the right where all the truck parks are, and the A140 now that skirts the village of Yaxley and comes directly in line with the arrow. The two hard standings where the council dump are on the left-hand side of the A140 still remain today. There's only, out of the 65 hard standings that were constructed or thereabouts, there are only 3 remaining today. And there's Arnold Delmonico, the captain, stood behind the 490th, or shall I say perched behind the 490th photo lab, and all his men behind, who are largely responsible for a lot of the photographs you're looking at in this presentation. The 8th Air Force was divided into 3 air divisions, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Air Division. The 1st Air Division operated airfields in the Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, Huntingdonshire region. The 2nd Air Division were entirely in Norfolk, flying B-24 Liberators, and the 3rd Air Division were primarily in Suffolk, with a couple of bases over the River Waveney into Norfolk, and that comprised the 8th Air Force, 3 air divisions. Of all of the combat jobs in the Second World War, from infantryman to submariner, none was statistically more dangerous than that of a man in a bomber over Germany. And this is Captain Bob Barraclough from the 490th Bomb Group inspecting the damage to his front windshield on return from a mission over Germany from Eye. At peak strength, the 8th Air Force could muster up to 2,000 bombers and 1,000 escort fighters on a single mission, and they did just that on the Christmas Eve 1944 mission, December the 24th, 1944. The ground troops in the Ardennes campaign were really coming under heavy fire, and they were bogged down and they were desperate for air support. And although the weather was totally marginal, the 8th Air Force mounted the biggest mission in aviation history. 3,000 aircraft in the sky, all taking off from East Anglian airfields around us. Nearly every one of those aircraft would have flown over this part of the country on their way out to the Ardennes and back again. It was an amazing undertaking that even Hollywood has never been able to repeat. It was a form of warfare that almost became obsolete no sooner than it had finished, with the advent of the jet engine and how technology moved on. What a sight that must have been to see those 3,000 aircraft take to the sky. The formation stretched out over 120 miles, containing 20,000 airmen on their way to war. This vast aerial armada of men and machines. Well, the temperatures at altitude could be anything up to minus 60 or 70 degrees in unpressurized aircraft, on oxygen, in the extreme cold, wearing heavy flying clothing in an effort to keep warm. And there was an admission charge. Every time they sent the bombers over, there was a price to pay. If the bombardiers got their bombs on the target, they dropped them where they were supposed to and they obliterated the target, it was a successful mission. If they missed the target totally, they had to go back again the next day and repeat it. The admission charge could be doubled. And this is a photograph of a B-17 receiving a direct flak hit on the bomb run. You can see this aircraft to the right is dropping its bombs. It had a direct flak hit into the main body of the aircraft, and all 10 men on the aircraft were killed. They were stationed with the 486th Bomb Group at Sudbury on the Suffolk-Essex border. And some equally thought-provoking photographs to reflect upon the men we're here to honour today, both on the Roll of Honour, on the wall in the town hall, and up at the memorial. And another photograph taken back at Eye, the damage to the fuselage below the navigator's compartment in the nose of the B-17, and the blanket over the stretcher tells you everything you need to know. On the 5th of January 1945, there was a tragic incident over Bury St Edmunds when 2 B-17 Flying Fortress from this base, the 490th at Eye, getting into formation for the mission of the day, again in very marginal weather conditions, collided with each other. And out of the 19 aircrew on board the 2 aircraft, 16 were killed and 3 were extremely badly injured. They ended up being shipped back to the States and never flew again. All of these losses are named on the Roll of Honour here in the town hall. And the wreckage landed in and around the grounds of the Bury St Edmunds sugar beet factory, with most of the wreckage landing in the purification and settling pools. And the grisly task of recovering all the bodies was not concluded until the summer of 1945, when the water had finally dropped enough in the pools to recover everything that was there. It's these sort of gruesome incidents that we have to have in our minds when we think about the names on that Roll of Honour. And as I say, that's what we're here for today. Fortunately, the Historic Monuments, Battle Monuments Commission, and both Commonwealth and American do our war dead and the American war dead very proud. The cemetery at Madingley that we're going to tomorrow, on land gifted from Cambridge University for the purpose at the end of the war on the outskirts of Cambridge, is a fine, fitting place for these guys to reside. But at war's end, some 3 million young Americans had passed through this country, which is a staggering statistic in its own right. 3 million on a tiny little island like we are, all to help the war effort. And I don't know where this photograph is taken, probably London or maybe Liverpool, but entirely representative of what youngsters in the area would have remembered: the relentless convoys, the military convoys on the road. Petrol was under ration, very few civilian vehicles on the road. Lion's share of the traffic in the war would have been military traffic to and fro from the bases, transporting the bombs from the railway station to the base, transporting the gasoline to demount the missions, transporting the food supplies. Again, the story of supply with the 8th Air Force is a book in its own right. So we come to victory, May the 8th, 1945. This photograph is taken. In fact, you can see the clock tower. That clock tower is up there. So we are just behind where this photograph was taken. Lovely colour image. It's in and around Victory, VE Day, because you can see all the flags out. And of course, it was time for the Americans to pack up and go home. Their job was concluded. They left here firmly in the belief that they would be going back to America to regroup and be deployed to the Pacific to carry on the Japanese war. For them, they didn't necessarily think when they left here that the war was over. Of course, we now know that events overtook them, and by August 1945, the Japanese surrender had taken place and the world was at peace. But when they left here, they didn't know that. And here I forget where this photograph is taken. It's one of the 2nd Air Division bases in Norfolk, but it is entirely representative of every air base, including Eye. And the locals came out and waved the guys farewell. So where are we now, 70-odd years from the date, looking forward? Lots of memorials around the region representing the units that were stationed here. A couple of then and now photographs for you to ponder. Here we are at Eye. Very little changes in 70 years in sleepy old Suffolk. 1964 in Eye. Guys were already starting to come back. Guys that were stationed here during the war, they're being drawn back. They want to see where they spent their formative years. And here we can see a navigator, Paul E. Sobel, coming back to Eye 20 years after he did his combat missions from here. This photograph taken in the early 1950s of Eye. We don't know who took it. We don't know exactly when it is. We can roughly get the date by looking at the vintage cars in it and making a judgment. It's certainly early 1950s. It's a fantastic colour Kodachrome slide, and it came with a collection of material from the United States. So I'm almost convinced that that was taken by a returning American from the base coming back to Eye to see what he thought of the place 10 years on. And again, very little changes. A Liberator from the 490th that's run off the end of the runway at Eye into the field alongside the A140. That's the exact spot, because you can see the terrace of houses behind it, Pretoria Villas on the Eye Road. You can see the chimneys just in front of the Liberator bomber there. That's Pretoria Villas. You might recognise that view more for the locals amongst us. And again, the same scene being used to review the officers on the 9th of June 1945. Doesn't look much of a parade ground, does it? But that's clearly what it was being used for. The rookery in Eye. The guys off duty in a 6x6 truck, posing for the photographer, the exact same location, the same house. The foliage is grown, but the location is much the same. And looking south from the northern end of the main runway, you can see the exact same position. You can maybe get your bearings from the 4 wind turbines that we have on the airfield today. The old curacy at Broome Street that Peter West, the local farmer, tells us was an officers converted into an officers off-duty club for the purpose. And you can see the officer there stood in the doorway in the snow. And the curacy has changed very little. Doesn't even look like they've changed the thatch. And on the perimeter track, just up behind the little industrial estate where the recycle centre is, on the tarmac there, exactly the same spot on the edge of the runway with the Liberators heading up the perimeter track, heading off on a mission. And the crash at the Broome Swan. These photographs are in the Swan if you ever go in there. The B-24 Liberator had a bad accident there coming into land, and the wreckage ended up all across the A140 outside the Swan, with 2 members dying from their injuries. And another mid-air collision over Diss. This time it was a practice formation mission. The unit, as Eric told us, had recently changed from Liberator bombers to B-17 bombers, where they couldn't just go off on missions in combat conditions. They had to familiarise themselves on type. And unfortunately, on this particular Sunday morning in August, 2 of the aircraft collided. One landed at Thelneetham, and the other one landed at Factory Lane, Roydon. And that's the wreckage, landed in the front garden of that council house in Roydon. The living quarters on Nix Lane, you can still see the big oak tree on the left-hand side remains unchanged, and the concrete pads where the Nissen huts were are still there today. And the very first concrete that the 829th engineers put down at Potash Lane is still there today, leading towards the communal sites where the 490th lived. And Peter West's barn at Church Farm in Broome Village. You can see again, the barn is in a fairly sorry state, but entirely recognisable from when it was on the 12th of February 1945 for General Partridge's inspection of the troops. And looking down from the northern end of the runway, we can pinpoint this photograph absolutely exactly because of the firing in butts, which is the great big mound of earth alongside the A140 that the bombers would lump the lead of the 50 caliber machine guns into to test fire their guns before they took off. And so we can pinpoint that shot absolutely to the inch as to where the original photographer was standing. What must that have sounded like with all those fortresses, one after the other, taxiing up the perimeter track and heading off to war? It's quite humorous that they decided to build the only firing in butts right alongside the main road. We just hope that the gunners were a good aim. I took this photograph a couple of years ago from Hardwick Warbird's T6 Texan. I was in the back seat, hanging out the side of the cockpit with my camera. I'm very proud of that photograph because not only has it got the entire base at Eye in the shot, but it's also got the star and bar. And the star and bar really makes the shot, brings it together. You can see the 2 wind turbines there at that point. That's looking up from the south. And some statistics for you to ponder about the 490th before we conclude. They had the lowest combat losses of any 8th Air Force outfit, 22 aircraft missing in action. But some 32 aircraft were lost in non-combat operations, such as the mid-air collision over Diss we've just been discussing. The first mission was the 31st of May 44, and the last mission was the 20th of April 45. So this enormous Herculean effort to build this facility that we've seen demonstrated had little more than 12 months usage. 158 missions in total, including 5 food drops to the starving people in Holland. There's a gentleman in the audience here tonight, a local man who went on 2 of those missions as an air cadet. The aircraft departed Eye on the 6th and the 8th of July. The ground echelon departed on the 26th of August. And as Eric told us, by the 7th of November 1945, the 490th Bomb Group ceased to exist. Shouldn't be forgotten, should it? That's why we're all here today. very pleased about the fact that this project has involved the local students at Hardersmere High School. That's where we've got to pitch it, because that's what's going to keep it going. This is my daughter, Leah's daughter, who's on the committee, at the air show at Tibenham, year before last, watching Grandad flying his Mustang, that weather permitting we'll see at lunchtime today. And my daughter at the American Air Museum at Duxford, looking at the B-17, pulling a smile for the camera. We have a guest of honour in the audience tonight. Last man standing. We'll speak to Si later, but just wanted to recognise him. When Si speaks, I wanted you to be able to see what he looked like back then. We got him back into the cockpit at Duxford the day before yesterday, with great difficulty, but we got him in there, and he sat there for the photograph. I thought he was going to faint on me because it was so hot. But to be able to sit on the flight deck of a B-17 with a guy who'd done 33 missions to this base is pretty good. And there he is on the right-hand side with his crew, taken up on the base after they got back from Poland. They crashed their aircraft in Poland on their 33rd mission and then had to finally get back to Eye. And this is showing them with some of the treasures that they liberated while they were there. This is Si up here on the top right, wearing his B-10 flying jacket with a moleskin collar. I normally conclude this presentation with this photograph, which is sums up basically what we've been talking about, reflecting on the photographs we've looked at. But for this occasion, I'm going to end with this photograph because there's a Thank you, we've made it.
Thank you very much, Clive. Again, as usual, brilliant. Right, we get to the stage now where we are preparing to go to the next part up on the airfield. Can I ask you all to please stand?